I stood in the doorway, frozen, 1,000 thoughts colliding in my mind. I had expected a quiet evening with my son, maybe a hot cup of tea and a moment to catch my breath. Instead, here he was, the man I once called my husband, stepping back into our home as if he still had the right. Yet he wasn't alone. There was a woman at his side. Too young, too polished, with that smug tilt to her chin that spoke of victory. Her manicured fingers clung to his arm possessively, and beside her stood a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 at most. He peered at me, at the walls, at the family portraits, wide brown eyes taking everything in like he belonged here. My husband. No, the man who used to be my husband, cleared his throat, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes that swiftly hardened into arrogance. His voice, laced with a smugness that made my stomach lurch, cut through the silence. "Evelyn, meet Sabrina," he said, motioning to the woman. "My fiancée." My heart hammered so loudly that I could almost feel the vibration in my bones. My fingers twitched at my sides, wanting to reach for something, anything. A lamp, a vase, maybe my dignity. But I stood motionless, refusing to let him see how deeply his words sliced into me. Instead, I kept my face still, my expression unreadable. "And this," Richard continued, gesturing toward the small boy, "is Oliver, my son." My son. The shock of it settled into my gut like a cold stone. I forced air into my lungs, forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Your son?" I asked, tilting my head ever so slightly. He gave me a cruel little smile, as though he was relishing my supposed ignorance. "Yes, my son," he said, "the one I should have been raising instead of wasting years in a dead marriage." I felt fury coil hot in my chest, but I swallowed it back. "Not yet." Sabrina laughed softly, the sound of honeyed condescension. "I know this is hard for you, Evelyn, but Richard and we just want a fresh start," she said, her eyes brimming with a pity that felt more like a personal insult. In her mind, she had already won. I could see it in the subtle quirk of her lips, the way she surveyed the living room like it was hers. Richard, always the grand strategist, had spent months, maybe years, chipping away at our marriage. Business trips, emergency assignments, late-night meetings, all while I was at home raising our 16-year-old son, Nathan, and trying to maintain the facade of a normal family. I suspected something was off, but not like this. Not him walking in the door with a fiancé and a hidden child he now flaunted in my face. I smiled, a small, razor-sharp curve of my lips. "Oh, Richard," I murmured, "you really have no idea, do you?" Nathan was out that evening, movie night with friends. So the house felt bigger, emptier, like every piece of furniture and every shadow on the wall was holding its breath. A single knock shattered the silence. 3 sharp raps that made my heart jump. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch under the glow of the porch light, a folder clutched in his hand, eyes so cold they might as well have been made of steel. "It's time," he said, stepping inside as though he still owned the place. He tossed the folder onto the kitchen counter. "Divorce papers. I want everything settled by the end of the month. You and Nathan need to be out of here before I get back from my next business trip." He paused, as if to check my reaction, but my face gave nothing away. "I'll even cover some of your moving expenses, out of generosity, of course." Generosity. My throat felt tight, but I forced my posture to remain calm. "So you expect me to just leave?" I asked, crossing my arms. "This house was never yours to begin with," he replied, shrugging. As if the mere mention of the house's ownership would send me scuttling away like a frightened animal. I took a measured breath. "Oh, Richard, you really should have looked at the deed before making that assumption," I said softly. For the briefest flicker of a moment, I saw doubt in his eyes. Then he recovered, forging ahead, unwavering in his belief that he had the upper hand. "Sabrina and Oliver will be moving in next week. You need to start packing." Sabrina stepped farther into the kitchen, trailing her manicured nails across the countertop, a slow and deliberate show of ownership. "I can't wait to redecorate," she murmured, her voice dripping with anticipation. That was when Nathan walked in, dropping his backpack by the door. He surveyed the trio, his father, Sabrina, and this unknown child. His expression a storm of confusion and anger. Mom, he said, his gaze flicking from me to Richard, then back again. Richard turned to him, hardly missing a beat. Nathan, this is Sabrina. She's... Dad, Nathan interjected, his tone sharp, his eyes blazing. Who the hell is this kid? Richard's face tightened, color rising in his cheeks. Watch your tone, he snapped, but Nathan didn't budge. Answer the question, he insisted. Sabrina made a small gasping sound, attempting to appear shocked and wounded. Nathan, I know this is... I wasn't talking to you, he said coldly, cutting her off. For a moment, pride and heartbreak mingled in me. He was standing up for himself for both of us, but the situation was so vile, so twisted, that I couldn't help feeling the ache of betrayal. Richard sighed, exasperation evident in every tense line of his body. His name is Oliver, he said. He's your brother. Nathan let out a hollow laugh, bitterness etched into every syllable. My brother, he repeated. You mean the kid you had with some random woman while you pretended to be faithful? Sabrina stiffened, her carefully composed facade cracking. Richard glared at Nathan. Watch yourself. Why? Nathan challenged, taking a step forward. Because I'm pointing out the truth. Because you think you can just replace me. Silence clamped down on the room, suffocating and cruel. Richard's face hardened with anger, but I could see something else flicker there. Guilt, or maybe just frustration at losing control. Nathan's voice dropped to a lethal quiet. You're pathetic, Dad, he said. And if you think you can just toss Mom and me aside because you decided to start a new family, you're even more clueless than I thought. Richard's face flushed a deep red. That's enough, he roared, voice echoing off the walls. But Nathan held his ground. No, Dad, it's not. He turned to me, his gaze unwavering, strong. Mom, he said. Tell them. I locked eyes with my son, then turned my attention back to Richard. I could see the trace of smugness still lingering around his expression, as though he believed everything would proceed exactly as he'd planned. Actually, Richard, I said, my tone controlled, we're not the ones leaving. I walked to the side table by the couch, retrieved a thick manila envelope, and dropped it on the counter. Richard frowned, flipping it open. The moment he realized what he was looking at, his expression faltered. Property ownership records, all in my name, stared back at him like a damning accusation. That's not possible, he whispered, eyes moving between the documents and my face. I leaned forward, a smirk dancing on my lips. It is, as of last week, and there's nothing you can do about it. Silence followed, heavy as a storm cloud. Then chaos descended. Sabrina gasped, stepping closer to Richard, scanning the paperwork as though she could will it to change. Richard slammed the folder shut, his voice trembling with anger. No, he insisted, as if denial alone could reshape reality. Yes, I said, savoring his unraveling. This house, Richard, is mine. The only people leaving are you. His eyes roamed wildly, searching for a loophole, for some magical trick to regain power. Oliver clung to Sabrina's leg, sensing the tension in the air. Sabrina turned toward Richard, fury and betrayal contorting her features. You told me this was your house, she hissed. You told me. It was, he insisted, but even he didn't sound convinced. Nathan let out a short, mirthless laugh. Wow, Dad, you really didn't think to check the paperwork. That's a rookie mistake. Richard's mind worked feverishly, desperation rising like a tide. He'd expected me to leave quietly, probably go find an apartment somewhere, living off whatever meager funds he decided to throw my way. He never imagined the ground would shift beneath his feet like this. He tried to fire back. You think this changes anything, he snarled, his voice dangerously low. You and Nathan can't just squat here out of spite. I sighed as if bored. Richard, have you always been this dense, or did leading a double life make you lose brain cells? His face twisted in rage. Sabrina clutched his arm, shrillness creeping into her voice. Tell me you can fix this, she demanded. He tore his arm from her grip, rounding on me again. You can't just steal my property. Actually, your father gave it away, I said. At the mention of Henry, Richard's father, My ex-husband's face blanched. Henry transferred this house to me months ago, I continued, noticing how Sabrina's expression shifted from anger to confusion. He never liked how you treated him or me or Nathan for that matter. Turns out, he had one last move up his sleeve. You're lying, Richard whispered, but we both knew I wasn't. He clenched his jaw so tightly that a muscle in his cheek twitched. If you're so sure I'm lying, I said, gesturing at the documents. Go ahead, show me where it says otherwise. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes, not just arrogance or fleeting anger. Actual bone-deep fear. Because everything was slipping through his fingers. Sabrina, still standing by Oliver, looked between us, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She turned on Richard, her voice now laced with fury. You said this would be simple, that it would all be yours. Richard squared his shoulders. His pride was the only thing holding him upright. This isn't over, he growled. I'll take this to court. You have no right. Oh, Richard, I murmured, shaking my head. Do you really want that? He narrowed his eyes, unsure. Because if we go to court, every skeleton in your closet, every bank record, every secret meeting, every invoice for your side families, comes spilling out. Are you absolutely sure you want that kind of attention from your employer? Nathan, who had been quietly observing, let out a dark chuckle. Face it, Dad, you're screwed. At that moment, Sabrina whipped around, eyes blazing. Her carefully cultivated manicure tapped a furious beat against the countertop. What is he talking about, Richard? Richard said nothing, which only made it worse. Nathan, amused at the unraveling scene, lifted a brow. Oh, Sabrina, you didn't know? My father has quite the track record. He's not exactly a one-woman man. In that instant, Sabrina's composure disintegrated. Her eyes shone with shock and betrayal. Oliver clutched her skirt, glancing up anxiously. Then Richard's phone began to buzz, an ominous hum slicing through the tension. He glanced at the caller ID and paled. He let it go to voicemail, but then an email alert pinged. I caught the moment he opened it, and all the blood drained from his face. Nathan peered over his shoulder. Bad news, Dad. Richard's head whipped toward me. You, his voice cracked. You sent this to my company? Of course, I replied with a slow, satisfied nod. They deserved to know how one of their executives was abusing his travel budget for personal affairs. Sabrina spun fully toward Richard now, anger turning to something colder, sharper. You told me you had everything under control. You said that once Evelyn and Nathan were out, we'd be set. I left my life for you. He tried to soothe her, but his voice trembled. Sabrina, I can fix this. With what, I asked, a feigned concern dripping from my tone, your soon-to-be non-existent paycheck. Because I doubt Sabrina's the sort of woman who enjoys coupon clipping. Right, Sabrina. She inhaled sharply, tears of rage welling in her eyes. You, she spat at Richard, you lied to me about everything. I didn't sign up for this mess. Oliver whimpered, his small voice lost in the tension. Before anyone could say another word, Sabrina grabbed his hand and marched toward the front door. Where are you going? Richard demanded, voice laced with desperation. She paused in the doorway, looking back over her shoulder with contempt. Somewhere that isn't here, she hissed, and then she was gone, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. For a moment, Richard just stood there, stunned, as though he couldn't believe how completely his plans had crumbled. Nathan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. That was brutal, he murmured, then turned to me with the faintest grin. But, Mom, that was a masterpiece. I met his gaze, letting the corner of my mouth lift. I felt lighter, as though some invisible chain around my lungs had snapped. I turned to Richard, who now looked like a broken man. Get out, I said calmly, pointing toward the door Sabrina had just used. He stared at me, no witty retort, no confident sneer. Just defeat. Finally he shuffled out. I heard the echo of his footsteps on the porch, and then he disappeared into the night. I locked the door behind him, leaning my forehead against the cool wood for a moment, letting relief wash over me. Nathan hovered at my shoulder. You okay? He asked softly. I turned, exhaling a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a decade. I'm okay, I answered, and I meant it. But Richard's downfall was just beginning. The first aftershock arrived 3 days later. It happened sooner than I expected. His boss apparently had zero tolerance for scandal and fraud. I discovered the news through a text from an unfamiliar number. Richard got fired. Thought you'd like to know. I showed Nathan, who let out a low whistle. Didn't think it would happen so fast, he mused, arching a brow. Guess forging expense reports for secret getaways is a no-no. I allowed myself a small, vindicated smile. Guess so. I received a furious email from Richard that same night. You ruined my career, Evelyn. Are you happy now? Yes, I thought, reading his words without the slightest pang of guilt. Very. With the job gone, Richard's lofty lifestyle collapsed like a sandcastle under a tidal wave. The lease on his luxury car defaulted, credit cards maxed out, and the hush money he'd been funneling to Sabrina or whoever else he'd been seeing dried up. Soon the calls began. They moved from anger, you had no right, to pleading, can we just talk? To pitiful, please Evelyn, I'm desperate. I ignored every single one, erasing them from my phone and from my life. Nathan watched me do it once, late in the afternoon, as I casually deleted a string of messages from Richard. He shook his head, smirking. Mom, you're ruthless. There was no accusation in his voice, only approval. I shrugged, dropping my phone onto the couch. He tried to leave us with nothing. Now he's reaping what he sowed. As for Sabrina, she showed up on my doorstep just once, looking disheveled and furious, like a Barbie doll left out in the rain. Her mascara smudged under her eyes. Her hair frizzed from stress and lack of sleep. She stared at me, breath hitching with barely contained rage. You think this is funny, she snarled, that you won? I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. Well, yes, actually. Do. Sabrina's eyes burned with hatred, and she spat out, Richard's broke. No job, no savings, nothing. And I'm stuck in this nightmare. He promised he'd give me a better life. My lips quirked in a half-smile. Maybe you should have invested in better stock, I said softly, stepping back as her temper flared. She let out a growl of frustration and stomped back to her car without another word. Nathan, who had been eavesdropping from behind the curtains, burst into laughter as she peeled out of our driveway. I almost feel bad for her, he said. Almost. Over the next few months, I heard about Richard's downward spiral through mutual acquaintances. He sold off his possessions in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Eventually, even his father, Henry, decided that enough was enough. Disgusted with Richard's behavior, Henry updated his will, removing Richard as an heir. I only knew because Henry wrote me a letter, explaining his decision. I won't leave my legacy to a man who can't manage his own life with honesty and integrity. Let Nathan inherit what Richard should have had. I want someone worthy to carry on the family name. I showed Nathan the letter. He read it twice, swallowing hard. So that means, he began but couldn't finish the sentence. I placed a hand on his shoulder. It means your grandfather's trust belongs to you now, I said gently. For a moment Nathan stood there, stunned. Then his face hardened with a resolve that made me proud. I won't waste it, Mom, he promised. I know, I replied. In the end I sold the old house. There were too many memories in its walls, some beautiful, most tarnished by the betrayal that had seeped into every crevice. Nathan and I found a new place not too far away. It was smaller but cozier, with a bright kitchen and a big window in the living room where the sunlight streamed in at dawn. For once, I was able to decorate exactly how I wanted, picking out furniture and paint colors without having to compromise with anyone. Nathan had a space for his gaming and his friends, and I set up a small corner as my writing nook. I hadn't expected my writing to gain an audience. It started as a journal, a way to process the emotional wreckage. But as I dug deeper, I found I had a knack for weaving stories that resonated with readers online. A small following grew, then a larger one, until a modest publishing house reached out, asking if I'd like to collaborate. My cynicism flared at first. Was this another trap? But the editors were genuine, and soon enough I signed a contract. A few weeks after the paperwork was finalized, Nathan looked up from his phone one evening, eyebrows raised. "Mom, do you realize you're about to be a published author?" I smiled back, feeling a mixture of disbelief and pride. Life was moving forward in a direction I'd never anticipated, and I owed a piece of that to the heartbreak that had once threatened to consume me. I bumped into Richard once at a grocery store. He looked worn down, dressed in wrinkled clothes, lines etched into his face like regrets carved in stone. He spotted me in the produce aisle and froze, eyes darting away. My cart squeaked forward on its crooked wheel, and I paused, meeting his gaze for a split second. There was no recognition of the man I used to know, only a hollow echo of what he'd become. Neither of us said a word. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, shoulders sagging beneath the weight of his own choices. Later that night, Nathan and I sat on the couch, half watching a silly comedy while I pretended to read a manuscript. He asked, "Do you think Dad will ever really change?" I thought about it, sifting through the years of betrayal, the illusions, the coldness that had seeped into his heart. "Some people don't know how to," I finally answered. Nathan accepted that with a quiet nod, returning to the show. Time kept marching on. Seasons turned. I spent afternoons at the cafe, sipping tea and writing, letting my imagination wander to places far away from the traumas of the past. Every day, I felt the shackles of Richard's betrayal slip further from my consciousness, replaced by a growing sense of peace and possibility. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some impulse made me pick up. "Hello," I said warily. There was a heavy pause, then a voice I knew all too well. "Evelyn." My heart didn't race. My stomach didn't drop. I simply waited for him to continue. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone even. His sigh crackled through the line. "I was wondering if we could talk. Maybe meet up somewhere." I considered the request, thought about all the times I had waited for him to say those words when we were still married. Back when I believed an apology might mend the cracks. Now it just felt hollow. "I'm sorry, Richard, there's nothing left to say." The silence stretched. "Evelyn, please," click. I ended the call, deleted the number, and set my phone aside with a sense of finality. That evening, Nathan and I celebrated absolutely nothing. Just the fact that we were together, free, content. We made popcorn, lounged around in our pajamas, and watched something ridiculous on TV. I felt a bubble of laughter rise in my chest. It's good, I thought, to be able to laugh without worrying about what it might cost me. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I realized the best revenge I had taken on Richard wasn't destroying his career or exposing his lies. The best revenge was simply living, thriving, and finding happiness despite everything he'd done. Months later, a crisp autumn breeze swirled outside. I watched the leaves swirl across our yard, orange and red and gold, painting the season with vibrant color. I leaned on the windowsill, sipping my tea, remembering how suffocated I used to feel in that old house, in that old life. Nathan strolled in, dropping onto a bar stool at the kitchen island, rummaging for snacks. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, glancing my way. Smiled. Better than okay." He grinned, pulling out a bag of chips. "Want some?" And that was it, simple, easy contentment. My phone buzzed with a notification from my publisher, letting me know they'd scheduled a meeting with a production company interested in adapting one of my stories for television. I felt a thrill of excitement flutter through me. This was my life now. Opportunities, creativity, new beginnings. I sat down beside Nathan, grabbing a handful of chips. He teased me about healthy eating, and I flicked a crumb at him. We laughed, and it echoed in the small house that had become our sanctuary. In the end, Richard had done me a favor. His betrayal had forced me to confront the person I was, and the person I wanted to be. It led me down a path of independence, self-discovery, and eventually happiness. I no longer felt bound by the past. Even the memories no longer stung as they once did. People always ask if someone like Richard can ever change. Maybe not. But the truth is, it doesn't matter to me anymore. My story diverged from his, and I had no interest in retracing old steps. Life is too short to spend it grieving for a man who never truly cared about anyone but himself. I realized, too, that I wasn't the same woman who trembled at the sight of him stepping into my home with another woman on his arm. That woman had grown, had taken back her power, had learned that betrayal doesn't have to define you, can shape you, push you, make you stronger if you let it. Some people might say that what I did was merciless, that I should have handled it more gently. But those people never saw me lying awake at night, worrying over bills he forgot to pay, or crying alone in an empty bed while he claimed he was on a business trip. They never felt the cut of his disregard, the slow erasure of my worth. They weren't there when I discovered text messages, suspicious credit card charges, half-truths that fell apart under scrutiny. No, mercy was not something Richard had earned. And if fate was kinder to me than it was to him, well, that was no coincidence. I had simply made sure that every one of his deceptions came back to haunt him. One day, as I was organizing some old boxes, I stumbled across a photo of us, me, Richard, and Nathan, taken at some corporate event years ago. We looked happy, though now I realized how superficial that smile on Richard's face truly was. I traced the edges of the photograph, noticing how small I looked, both physically and emotionally, next to him. Then I slipped it back into the box, carried it to the fireplace, and let the flames devour it. Nathan asked me why I burned it. Because it doesn't represent who we are anymore, I answered, watching the embers glow. That seemed reason enough. Weeks later, I got a letter from Henry, Richard's father. It was formal but kind, telling me he respected my decision to move away, to start fresh. He thanked me for always being decent to him, for never shutting him out, even when Richard had. It ended with a simple line that brought tears to my eyes. "You were more of a daughter to me than Richard was a son." I wrote back, thanking him for trusting me enough to transfer the house into my name and for safeguarding Nathan's future. Henry's health was declining, and I knew he might not have much time left, but his spirit remained strong. He had used his final resources, his final acts, to ensure justice for me and Nathan. That gesture meant the world. When Henry passed, he left behind a modest fortune that would one day go to Nathan. I made sure Nathan understood this wasn't about greed. It was about legacy and the hope Henry had that someone in the family would uphold values of honesty and loyalty. Nathan took that responsibility seriously, pledging to use the inheritance wisely, maybe for college, maybe to start a business that could give back to the community. Richard tried to contest Henry's will, of course. He marched into the reading, all haggard indignation, claiming the inheritance should be his by birthright. But Henry's legal team had left no room for argument. Every detail was airtight. Richard left that room looking more broken than ever. The last time I saw him, he was sitting in his car, shoulders slumped, fists clenched around the steering wheel. I didn't approach him. There was nothing left to say. Ultimately, the dust settled. Nathan and I continued building our lives, day by day, minute by minute, forging a bond so much stronger than before. Sometimes adversity does that. Brings you closer to the people who truly matter. I poured my energy into writing. Nathan excelled in school, found new hobbies, made new friends who supported him through everything. Evenings were spent in companionable silence sometimes, both of us reading, or he'd be playing a game while I typed away at my laptop. Other nights, we debated movies or laughed at inside jokes only we understood. The house, though small, was filled with warmth and acceptance, things money can't buy. When my first novel was published, Nathan joked about setting up a meet and greet in the living room. I teased him right back, reminding him I was just a small-time author, not a movie star. But a sense of pride swelled in my chest each time he bragged about my book to his friends. Slowly, I was learning to embrace this new life where I didn't have to tiptoe around a husband's ego or brace myself for betrayal. A year slipped by, then two. Sometimes I reflected on how drastically life had changed. The woman who once stood in that doorway, paralyzed by shock, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who knew how to protect what mattered, how to laugh freely, how to dream again. And that's the thing about revenge. People assume it's about destruction and chaos, about leveling your enemy. But real revenge, the kind that sticks, is simply living on your own terms, thriving in a way that your betrayer never imagined you could. Watching their illusions crumble while you stand tall, that's the sweetest justice of all. Eventually, I heard that Richard tried to rebuild his life, found a small job somewhere else, maybe as a mid-level manager in a company far less prestigious than his old one. I don't know. I didn't care to investigate. Once upon a time I might have. But not anymore. There's a freedom in letting go, in knowing you don't have to keep tabs on the person who hurt you because they no longer hold any power over your heart. One afternoon, I sat on my new porch, the late summer sun glowing on the horizon, painting everything in gentle golds and pinks. Nathan joined me, handing me a cold drink. We sipped in silence, content. Then he said, "So, do you think it's over? All of it?" I gazed at him, my grown son who had weathered more storms at 16 than most do by 30. "I think it's been over for a long time," I replied, "and we just didn't know it." He nodded, satisfied with that. The world isn't perfect, but ours felt pretty close at that moment. We had our little house, our future, and no one could take it away. My manuscripts were piling up. Stories of resilience, empowerment, maybe bits of fantasy here and there, but always that quiet undercurrent of triumph over adversity. Readers asked if I wrote from personal experience. Sometimes I'd smile to myself, thinking if only they knew. But I never gave specifics. Let them imagine. Let them glean that sense of hope from my words, the way I once needed hope when Richard's betrayal threatened to destroy me. In the end, the best part of my story wasn't how I brought him to his knees or how I exposed him to his company or how I forced him to face the consequences of his own actions. The best part was that I walked away from that house with my dignity intact, with my son's respect, and with my future wide open. I stood in the doorway once, frozen by shock. But now I stand in doorways by choice, thresholds that lead to new opportunities, new dreams, new chapters. And if I ever catch a hint of arrogance or betrayal drifting toward my life again, I'll remember the power I found within myself, and I'll know exactly how to protect what's mine. Nathan sometimes asks me if I think Richard regrets it all, if deep down he wishes he'd chosen differently. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But regret without change is meaningless. And from what I've seen, he's not the type to learn from mistakes. We can't dwell on that, though. We can only move forward, forging a story that belongs to us, not defined by anyone else's failings. Over time, new friendships blossomed. People who knew me only as the woman I'd become, not the wife of some corporate hotshot. They saw my writing, my laughter, my love for my son. And they liked me for who I was, not who I was married to. That might sound simple, but it felt revolutionary after years of living in someone else's shadow. Nathan graduated high school with honors, beaming in his cap and gown. I clapped until my hands hurt, tears of pride threatening to spill down my cheeks. Afterward, we went out for dinner, just the two of us, and talked about colleges, scholarships, and the bright horizon ahead. He joked that soon he'd be paying my bills, especially if the inheritance from Henry came through in a few years. I teased him that I'd never let him pay for anything, because I was going to be a best-selling author. We laughed because maybe both could be true. Who knows what the future holds? But I do know this. The past no longer has chains around my ankles. Richard's betrayal, once a suffocating weight, has transformed into a stepping stone, a launch pad propelling me into a life far richer than the one I thought I'd have with him. Sometimes late at night, I sit up in bed and let the silence wrap around me. My mind wanders back to the woman I used to be, the one who stood there, heart pounding, as her husband declared another woman his fiancée and introduced a hidden child in front of her. I wonder what she would say if she could see me now, sipping tea, typing out stories, unburdened by fear or regret. I think she'd be proud. I think she'd understand that every piece of heartbreak eventually found its purpose, forging a stronger version of herself. And that is the essence of the happy ending I never thought I'd get. It's not about riding off into the sunset with some new romance or parading around in expensive clothes. It's about standing tall in my own skin, comfortable and at peace, with the knowledge that I survived, I thrived, and I didn't let darkness snuff out my light. So tell me, if someone shatters your world the way Richard shattered mine, would you do the same? Would you tear down their illusions, expose their lies, strip them of everything they tried to steal from you? Or would you choose a different path, one of quiet departure, leaving them to their illusions while you find freedom elsewhere? Maybe there's no single right answer. But for me, I don't regret a thing. I took back my home, my dignity, my future. And in doing so, I became a woman I can respect, a woman who knows how to fight for herself and her child. That, in the end, was worth every moment of pain. Life goes on. Each morning, I wake up in a bed I chose, in a house that's mine, with the memory of a victory well earned. Nathan's laughter rings through the hallway, echoing with possibilities. My next manuscript waits on my desk, half finished, pages teeming with characters who might just find their own redemption or revenge. Outside, the sun rises, painting the sky in breathtaking hues, reminding me that every day is a new canvas. And I'm ready to write my next chapter, ready to love, laugh, cry, and most importantly, live on my own terms. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't destroying the enemy. It's making sure they become irrelevant, powerless to touch the bright, vast horizon stretching before you. And that, truly, is the happiest ending of all.